Across the ruins of Europe, victory bells hammered the sky, and celebratory rifles cracked like fireworks. But for a small group of women huddled in the shadow of a German rail yard, the sound was a death knell. Their uniforms, the threadbare gray-green of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, were ghosts of a fallen empire. Their boots were split, their hair matted from weeks of retreat, their faces, some barely 20, still held the architecture of youth beneath a mask of soot and bone-deep fatigue. They were the secretaries, the typists, the radio operators, the nurses, the quiet cogs of a war machine that had ground their world to dust and then shattered in their hands. Now, with the Reich broken, they were herded onto trains, not for a homecoming, but for a journey into captivity. The image was a strange and bitter inversion, lines of women in drab skirts and jackets dragging battered suitcases onto the same dark wooden boxcars that had once fed armies to the front. One clutched a rosary, another a last tin of rations. A girl from Hamburg, her voice a dry whisper, turned to her companion. "The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples." An officer from the Luftwaffe had told her so in the chaos of surrender. Another woman, taller, her face hardened from years spent manning anti-aircraft searchlights, said nothing, her jaw set, as if bracing for a physical blow. The propaganda had been relentless. The Allies, especially the Americans, were not men, but wolves. Captivity meant degradation, cruelty, and worse. The train rumbled west, a funeral procession through a landscape of ghosts. Charred towns drifted past the slats. Churches stood like skeletons, their steeples torn away. Bridges folded into rivers. Factories, their spines broken, still exhaled thin tendrils of smoke. From the embankments, children with faces as thin as paper waved without expression. At night, the train would halt with a shudder, and the women would huddle together against the cold, listening to the crunch of guards' boots on the gravel outside and the occasional distant pop of gunfire. A former secretary from Munich named Anna, clutching a small diary she'd managed to hide, wrote by the sliver of moonlight, "We are being taken far, none knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be." The journey ended not in a German camp, but in the sprawling chaos of occupied ports, Bremen, Le Havre, Cherbourg, where massive ships waited under the stark colors of the American flag. They were marched up the gangways, past soldiers whose expressions they couldn't decipher. Some looked curious, others indifferent. The women had steeled themselves for snarls, for insults, for blows. Instead, there was only order, paperwork, lines. They were counted, tagged, and divided into groups, a process that felt less like vengeance than a strange and chilling bureaucracy. As the ship's engines groaned to life and the coastline of Europe bled into the sea, horizon, a profound dread settled in their bones. Before them stretched the vast, empty canvas of the Atlantic. And on the other side waited America, a land of myth, of enemy caricature, of terrifying mystery. On board, seasickness became a great leveler, gripping them in the steel holds where bunks were stacked like shelves. The air grew thick with the smells of salt, diesel, and humanity. Then came the food, served on metal trays, pale bread, thick slabs of meat, and steaming mugs of coffee whose aroma alone was a memory of another life. The women stared. For years they had survived on cabbage stalks, on ersatzbrot made of sawdust and barley, on watery soup ladled from rusted cans. Some hesitated, their minds screaming poison. Others devoured it, hot tears of disbelief rolling down their faces at the simple, forgotten taste of real bread. "They feed us like they feed themselves," one whispered, her voice filled with a terrible astonishment. They had expected punishment. They had prepared for cruelty. This baffling civility unsettled them far more. When the ships finally cut through the waters of American harbors, New York, Boston, New Orleans, the women gathered on deck, their knuckles white as they gripped the rails. They stared at skylines that rose into the air, impossibly whole, untouched by a single bomb. The Statue of Liberty loomed over the water, an irony so sharp it drew no smiles. Crowds lined the piers, some jeering, some just watching in silence, as the German women were marched ashore. Their boots echoed on the wooden planks. The air smelled different here, cleaner, salted by the ocean, but untainted by the lingering ash of war. For the first time, a few began to grasp the true scale of their defeat. Germany was a graveyard of rubble. America was intact, prosperous, terrifyingly alive. Buses and trains carried them deep into the continent to camps built across the United States. Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and dozens more. Roads unspooled before them, flanked by green fields, and towns where children rode bicycles past houses, gleaming with white porches. For women who had watched their own cities burn to the ground, the sight was a hallucination. It was an assault. Was this truly the land of monsters? They whispered among themselves. Could this abundance be real? The Reich had promised them a glorious victory and delivered only ruins. The enemy they had been taught to hate and fear seemed to inhabit another universe. At the camp gates, their names were recorded, their few possessions catalogued, and their tattered uniforms exchanged for plain work clothes. But before they could rest, there was one final terrifying step. Guards, their manner firm but not brutal, directed them toward a single, ominous building. Inside, steam hissed, and water dripped from pipes. Their hearts began to hammer against their ribs. This was it. The humiliation, the degradation, the cruelty they had been warned of. In the long, silent line, whispers circled like frightened birds. This is where they will make us suffer. One woman clutched her suitcase like a shield. Another crossed herself, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The line shuffled forward, and as each woman stepped into the tiled room, the world they expected collided with the world that was. They were handed bars of soap, real soap, thick, white, heavy in the hand, smelling faintly, impossibly, of flowers. Then came clean towels, then clean garments. The showers rained down not gas, but streams of hot, clean water, washing away months of grime and fear. Some women began to weep openly, the sound echoing off the wet tiles. Others let out choked, nervous laughs, unable to process the relief. For the first time in years they felt clean, their hair free of lice, their skin scrubbed raw and new. It was not humiliation, it was a restoration, an act of humanity so profound it shook them to their very core. That night, Anna wrote in her diary again, her hand trembling. We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be? She didn't know it yet, but this moment, the simple, shocking act of being washed clean, would remain etched in their memories long after the war itself had faded. The women lay in their new bunks, hair still damp, wrapped in blankets that smelled of starch and cotton. Outside, the American night hummed with the sound of crickets, a world away from the thunder of guns. They whispered to each other in the dark, their voices low and urgent, sharing a secret too fragile to be spoken aloud. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps propaganda and fear had blinded them to a truth they couldn't yet explain. What awaited them in the coming days, the food, the work, the encounters with Americans, would prove even more astonishing. But for now, a single image lingered in every mind, the soap in their hands, slippery, fragrant, absurdly gentle. It was only the beginning of their captivity, yet it already felt like the beginning of something else. And as dawn broke over the camp, a question settled among them like morning mist. If the enemy could show such unexpected humanity, what other surprises lay ahead? The buses rolled through gates crowned with barbed wire, their engines grumbling as dust rose in pale clouds across the camp road. To the women inside, the sight was at once frightening and strangely orderly. Guard towers stood at intervals, soldiers lounging with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, and neat rows of barracks stretched across the fields. This was not the gray, chaotic brutality of a concentration camp they had secretly feared. This was something bewilderingly different. The wooden buildings were painted, the paths were swept, the fences were intact, but not menacing. They exchanged silent glances, each woman's eyes asking the same question. What world have we stepped into? As they filed off the bus, each was handed a numbered tag. American officers moved with clipped efficiency, scribbling on clipboards, stamping documents. The women stiffened, bracing for the insults and harsh commands that never came. The guards spoke with a calm detachment, their English tones softened by Southern draws or Midwestern flatness. For many, the first shock was not cruelty, but a profound indifference. The Americans treated them not as monsters to be reviled, nor as guests to be welcomed, but as something strangely ordinary, prisoners of war to be managed, catalogued, and housed. The delousing station had already unsettled them with its unexpected civility, but what came next was stranger still. After the showers, they were led to a mess hall. The long room was an assault of smells, coffee, fresh bread, and something rich frying in grease. The women froze in the doorway, disoriented by the aroma alone. Long tables stretched across the hall, laden with trays piled high with boiled potatoes, carrots, and thick beef stew. Soft rolls gleamed with butter. Steam fogged the windows. The air was thick and overwhelming, an assault of abundance. A guard motioned them forward. Reluctantly, they shuffled to the counter, where a cook in a white apron dropped generous spoonfuls of stew onto tin plates, slid slices of bread alongside, and filled mugs with dark coffee. The women took the trays as if handling explosives. Some couldn't meet the cook's eyes. Others simply stared at the food, unsure if it was real. In Germany, that final winter of war had reduced meals to black bread cut with sawdust, watery turnip soup, and, if you were lucky, a scrap of horse meat. Now, in the heart of the enemy's camp, they were being offered more in a single meal than they had seen in weeks. Anna, her diary tucked safely under her mattress, sat at a long table. She dipped her spoon into the stew, watching the grease float on the surface, the chunks of meat glistening. Tentatively, she brought it to her lips. Her eyes widened. She pressed a hand to her mouth, a gesture of shock that was almost shame. Around her, other women hesitated, then began to eat in a heavy silence, broken only by the scrape of cutlery on tin. Tears slid down the cheeks of some. One whispered, her voice cracking, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." Their own leaders had promised them humiliation at the hands of the enemy. The humiliation never came. There were no taunts, no jeers. The guards paced slowly, their expressions professionally detached. One young soldier, hardly older than the prisoners themselves, even offered a small, crooked smile as he passed, a gesture of awkward reassurance. They had steeled themselves for cruelty. This quiet civility was somehow more disturbing. In the days that followed, the strange inversions of camp life deepened. A bell woke them each morning. They were issued breakfast and assigned light duties. Some worked in the kitchens, others in nearby fields. Some in laundries where American uniforms were scrubbed and pressed. They were paid for this work in small slips of camp scrip, a currency they could use at the camp canteen. There, on plain wooden shelves, lay chocolates, cigarettes, pencils, even lipstick. The women stood before these goods as if before an altar. A bar of chocolate was a miracle, a tube of lipstick, an unthinkable luxury. And yet here it was, offered by the enemy in exchange for their labor. The irony was almost cruel. Back in Germany, their families scavenged for scraps in cities of ash. Children picked through rubble for a crust of bread. Letters, when they finally trickled in, were filled with a quiet despair. One woman read her letter aloud by candlelight, her voice trembling. "We live in the cellar now, the house above destroyed. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, send it." She folded the paper with shaking fingers, knowing she could not send food, only words. The gulf between their suffering homeland and the bizarre abundance of the camp yawned wider each day. A sense of shame, heavier than chains, began to settle upon them. They were the enemy, yet they were fed, clothed, sheltered. The Reich had demanded their total loyalty and in return had given them hunger and ruins. America, the sworn enemy, gave them soap and stew. This inversion gnawed at their souls, an unspoken but ever-present truth. At night they lay awake, listening to the crickets chirping outside the barracks, and wondered what it all meant. Not all adjusted easily. A few resisted, refusing to eat more than the barest minimum, hoarding bread crusts under their pillows, convinced the generosity was a trick. Rumors whispered through the bunks that the food might be drugged, the soap laced with some hidden poison. But day after day, nothing happened except the quiet, relentless routine of camp life. Their bodies fattened, their skin cleared, the lice vanished. Slowly, suspicion began to yield to a reluctant, bewildering acceptance. The Americans, too, watched with curiosity. Many of the guards had never seen German women before, only the snarling caricatures from propaganda posters. They were surprised to find them thin, exhausted, and often visibly frightened, girls who were no older than their sisters back home. One guard wrote in a letter, "They are not what we were told. They are girls, and they look at us as if waiting for a blow that never comes." And so the conflict deepened, not a war of guns and trenches, but one of perception. The women were being forced to reconcile the enemy they had imagined with the one before them. Each bite of bread, each bar of soap, each neutral word from a guard chipped away at the fortress of propaganda they had been raised in. The war in Europe had ended, but in their minds, another battle was just beginning. A battle between memory and reality, between what they had been told and what they could see with their own eyes. Anna captured it in her diary with painful clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts. It is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy. Dignity is unbearable. Her words spoke for many. The women no longer feared being broken by cruelty. They were beginning to fear being undone by kindness. One evening, after a day's work in the fields, they were marched back to camp as the sun dipped low, spilling gold across the horizon. The sky was vast and unmarred by smoke, the air smelling of cut grass. It was a simple, peaceful scene, yet it weighed on them more heavily than the ruins of their homeland ever could. Here was a land untouched, abundant, alive. The Reich had collapsed into rubble. America stood unscathed. And in that stark realization, a new and more profound unease took root. They had survived the first shock of the soap, the showers, the food. But something else was dawning now, something far more difficult to confront. In the days ahead, it would not be physical survival that would challenge them, but the slow, unsettling recognition that the enemy might be far more human and far more powerful than they had ever been allowed to imagine. The weeks settled into a rhythm, and within that rhythm, time began to dissolve. Morning bell, breakfast line, work detail, supper, lights out. The sharp edges of captivity dulled, replaced not by comfort, but by a quiet, persistent bewilderment. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also fed, clothed, even paid. A baffling reality for women raised in a collapsing Reich where loyalty was rewarded with starvation. This fundamental inversion gnawed at their thoughts more relentlessly than any barbed wire fence. Anna, who had once sat in a Munich office typing military orders she never questioned, now found herself in the camp laundry. The scent of starch and soap clung to her fingers as she pressed American uniforms smooth. Each shirt bore the initials of a man who was her sworn enemy. Yet as she folded them into neat piles, she felt less hatred than an odd, guilty relief. This was work that had nothing to do with war. It was work that kept her alive. Sometimes she would catch her own reflection in the polished steel of the washing drums and wonder who this person was, this healthy, well-fed captive. Others were sent under guard into the surrounding fields to harvest crops that fed both prisoners and soldiers. They felt the American sun on their backs, the dark soil under their fingernails, and the startling weight of baskets filled to the brim. A few even laughed softly at their own sweat, finding in the simple, honest labor a distant echo of the villages they had left behind. They returned to camp in the evenings, muscles aching, their spirits strangely lighter. This was not the degradation they had prepared for. This was something else entirely. The camp canteen quickly became the most bewildering corner of their new world. With their wages, small slips of camp scrip, they could buy things they hadn't seen in years: chocolate bars, cigarettes, even jars of jam. The first time Anna bit into a Hershey's bar, the sweetness exploded on her tongue, a ghost of a forgotten childhood. Tears pricked her eyes, and she turned away, ashamed of her own simple joy. A girl from Bremen smeared bright red lipstick on her lips and stared at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror with utter disbelief. "I feel human again," she murmured, as if confessing a terrible sin. But this abundance carried its own private torment. Letters from home continued to arrive, their words etched in desperation. Families wrote of bombed-out apartments, of children coughing in damp cellars, of bread lines stretching into the bitter cold. One woman read her mother's plea aloud to the silent barracks. "If only we had your American bread. Your brother starves." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the scratching of rats beneath the floorboards. The women sat clutching their letters, their trays of evening food suddenly untouched, the shame of their own plenty burning in their throats. The Americans noticed the contradiction, too. Guards were surprised to see the German women gaining weight, their cheeks filling out, their hair regaining its shine. "They're better fed than folks back home in some towns," one soldier muttered to another, his voice a mixture of resentment and wonder. But the rules of the Geneva Convention were clear. Prisoners were to be treated according to standards that often far exceeded those of war-torn Europe. The irony was not lost on anyone, yet suspicion never fully vanished. At night, whispers still crept through the bunks. What if this was all an elaborate facade? What if tomorrow the masks fell away and the real cruelty began? A few clung to their distrust, hoarding crusts of bread under their mattresses, convinced the abundance was a trap. But as weeks turned into months, even the most cautious were worn down by the relentless, grinding normality of American order. No beatings came, no punishments materialized beyond the dull monotony of work. The greatest cruelty, it seemed, was to be treated decently. Anna's diary became a record of this internal war. "I eat and my stomach thanks me. I sleep and my body grows strong, yet each kindness cuts me deeper. How do I reconcile this with the faces of children in Munich who drink water for supper?" To be brutalized would have been simpler. To be afforded dignity by the enemy was unbearable. Amid this turmoil, small, fleeting encounters with Americans deepened the contradictions. One evening, during roll call, a young guard dropped his flashlight. Anna stooped instinctively, picked it up, and handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed. For a single, charged instant, their eyes met. He gave a quiet nod, nothing more, but the moment replayed in her mind for days. Another time, a soldier passing the laundry hummed a soft, rhythmic tune, unmistakably American. A girl from Cologne recognized the melody from a forbidden radio broadcast, laughed, and began humming along. For a brief, impossible second, two enemies shared a song across a gulf the war had declared unbridgeable. Not all guards were friendly. Some looked at the women with open disdain, their gazes sharp with grief for brothers and friends lost in Europe. Yet even their hostility rarely spilled into action. The women were not free, but neither were they brutalized. They existed in a liminal state, suspended between punishment and reprieve, and it left them restless, uneasy, unable to anchor themselves in the cold certainty of hatred. Then came the day they were taken outside the wire for work details in nearby towns. They rode in the backs of trucks through American streets, their eyes wide. They saw shops with windows full of goods, children chasing hoops down clean sidewalks, men reading newspapers on porches untouched by bombs. They smelled the impossible sweetness of bakeries, saw rows of cars gleaming in the sun, watched movie posters plastered on brick walls. For women whose last memories of home were of cratered streets and charred ruins, the vision was overwhelming. America was not just intact, it was flourishing. That night the barracks buzzed with disbelieving whispers. Did you see the cars, the bread? It was white, the houses untouched. For some, the shock of America's prosperity was intoxicating. For others, it was the final, unbearable proof of Germany's total collapse. The Reich that had promised them an empire had left them only ruins. The enemy had delivered the world of plenty they had only dreamed of. It was a truth too large to swallow, too sharp to ignore. The war, once external, was now turning inward. In their hearts, loyalty battled with reality, pride with gratitude, hatred with a reluctant, creeping admiration. It was no longer a clash of armies, but a slow erosion of belief. Each bar of chocolate, each hot shower, each glimpse of an unbroken American street chipped away at the fortress of propaganda they had been raised inside. The women began to realize that the Reich had not only lied to them, it had stolen their very vision of the world. As the crickets sang outside the wire and the camp lights glowed like pale moons, Anna lay awake, staring at the rafters. She thought of her family in Munich, of her mother boiling weeds for supper, of the rubble where her office once stood. Then she thought of the American guard's quiet nod, the chocolate melting on her tongue, the clean water streaming down her back. Between these two sets of images stretched an abyss she could not yet cross. But she knew with a terrifying certainty that something inside her was shifting, something irreversible. As another dawn broke over the camp, gilding the barbed wire in gold, the women understood that survival was no longer the only question. The real challenge now lay in confronting what their captivity revealed about the enemy, their homeland, and most of all, about themselves. Autumn leaves, crisp and golden, drifted across the camp yard. The season had turned, though time inside the wire felt strangely fluid, its passage marked less by calendars than by the slow, steady rhythm of meals and work and letters from home. For months, the women had been reeling from the shock of survival in America, their days defined by soap and bread and a baffling, relentless civility. But now came the harder reckoning. What did it all mean for who they had been and who they were becoming? One evening, Anna sat on the barrack steps, her diary balanced on her knees. She wrote by the fading light, her words sharper, more urgent than before, as if the conflict churning inside her could no longer be contained. I have eaten more in captivity than in all the winters of the Reich. I have slept without fear of bombs, and yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is it where the enemy shows more dignity than our own leaders did? Her handwriting trembled. She paused, hearing a burst of laughter from a nearby group of women. They were trading pieces of candy, teasing one another about lipstick shades, their voices bright and carefree, as if the war had never touched them. Anna envied their lightness, but she could not join in. Her loyalty to her broken homeland was a weight she could not set down, even as it crumbled in her hands. The Americans, for their part, had grown accustomed to their unlikely prisoners. Some guards stopped seeing them as symbols of a hated regime and began to recognize them as individuals, frail, stubborn, bewildered, and sometimes even charming in their awkward attempts at English. A few would share cigarettes, passing them silently through the wire fence, in a gesture that felt more human than political. But for every act of quiet kindness, a chasm of distance remained. These were still the enemy, still prisoners, still reminders of lives lost overseas. The camp was never free of tension. It was only softened by routine. It was outside the wire, however, that the greatest revelations came. More frequently now, the women were sent into nearby American towns for labor under armed escort, but with a degree of freedom they had never imagined. They picked cotton in the fields, worked in canneries, or tidied municipal parks. The townspeople watched them with a mixture of curiosity, coldness, and indifference. Children gawked openly, pointing at the German girls, while shopkeepers peered from their doorways. But what struck the women most was not hostility, but an overwhelming sense of normalcy. American life flowed on, completely unbroken. Cinemas lit their marquees at night. Grocery stores displayed overflowing shelves of produce. Radios blared jazz and baseball scores. For women from cities where rubble had replaced boulevards, the sight was almost unbearable. One day, after hours of harvesting produce, Anna's group was given lunch in a church hall by local volunteers. The tables groaned under the weight of sandwiches, fruit, and pies. The women hesitated, their hands hovering over the food as if afraid it might vanish. An elderly American woman, flour dusting her apron, urged them gently, "Eat, eat." Anna bit into an apple, its flesh crisp and impossibly sweet, and she nearly wept. She had not tasted fresh fruit since 1942. Across the table, another prisoner whispered, "This is paradise." But Anna could only stare at the apple's pristine white flesh, hearing her mother's voice in her memory. Save the peel for the soup. The contrast nearly broke her. Back in the barracks at night, their conversations grew heavier. They spoke of home, of families surviving in cellars, of children walking barefoot in the snow, of brothers lost forever on the Eastern Front. Some began to admit aloud what had long been unspeakable, that perhaps their nation had lied to them, had sacrificed them not for glory, but for utter destruction. "We were taught they were beasts," murmured one woman, staring into her folded blanket. "But who are the beasts now, the ones who bombed our homes or the ones who built this world of plenty?" No one answered. The silence carried more weight than any words could. Yet guilt was not their only burden. Gratitude, too, was a profoundly unsettling force. They were prisoners, but they were alive, clean, and fed. They had expected to be stripped of all dignity. Instead, they had been given more than they had dared to imagine. The soap, the showers, the chocolate, these were all tokens of something larger, something harder to name. Was it mercy? Was it hypocrisy? Or was it simply that the Americans lived by a set of rules the Reich had long since abandoned? Each woman wrestled with these questions alone, unable to resolve them, but unable to turn away. Anna's diary grew into a confession of this turmoil. It would be easier to hate. Hatred is a fortress. It keeps the world out. But what they give us, the bread, the soap, the music, it slips past the walls. It demands we see them as human. And if they are human, then what becomes of all the blood, all the ruins, all the lies we swallowed? She closed the book one evening, unable to write more, her chest tight with a feeling that was dangerously close to betrayal. The guards, too, sensed the shift. They watched their prisoners laugh at American films shown in the makeshift camp cinema, saw them sing along clumsily but earnestly to songs on the radio. It was disarming, unsettling. "You'd forget for a minute they were the enemy," one sergeant remarked to another, "if you didn't look at the uniforms." The comment was as much a warning as an observation. War had demanded clear lines. This life was blurring them. The greatest shock, however, lay not in the food or the work or the glimpses of American streets, but in the mirror. Their bodies had changed, their faces filled out, their hair regained its luster. color returned to their cheeks. Some even looked younger, as if captivity had peeled away the years of war. To see themselves restored in this way was almost unbearable, for it forced them to recognize how deeply the Reich had failed them. The enemy had made them healthy. Their own nation had made them starve. It was not just a revelation. It was an indictment. And yet, even as they adjusted, even as laughter returned to the barracks, a new unease hung over everything, for they knew this could not last. One day they would be sent home, back to Germany, back to the rubble, back to families waiting in despair. The thought of leaving this abundance for hunger again, of trading soap for soot, filled them with a cold dread. More than one woman whispered it in the dark, "I am afraid to go back." It was a treasonous thing to admit, but it was true. As winter approached, rumors of impending transfers and repatriation spread through the camp like a fever. The whispers filled the barracks with a new anxiety. What awaited them in the ruins of their homeland? Would their families even recognize them, well-fed, clean, their cheeks glowing with the health of their captivity? Some dreaded the judgment they would see in their mother's eyes, the silent accusation that they had lived well, while others starved. Staring at her diary, Anna wrote the words she had never dared to think before. "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving." The confession chilled her, but it was honest. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been guns or bombs. It had been soap and food and dignity, and those things had done what hatred never could. They had changed her. One morning, as frost laced the camp fences with silver, the announcement came. A transport would be departing. The women crowded together, their hearts pounding, their eyes wide with questions they could not voice. To return meant facing hunger, ruins, and the ghosts of everything they had believed. To stay meant captivity, but also life. A guard read the names from a list, his voice flat and official, but to the women every syllable landed like a thunderclap. And as Anna heard her name called, as she stepped forward into the cold morning light, she realized the true war was no longer between nations. It was inside her, in the space where hatred had once lived, and where something new, fragile, dangerous, and undeniable had begun to grow.